Hello, everyone, and welcome to our GEMA Talks series. I am really pleased today to introduce Anne Thomopoulos, who is a partner at Legendary Global. Legendary Global is a mini studio and production entity on a global basis. We're going to talk a lot today about the global production world in film and television. Anne has, it's an incredible resume. She had a wonderful 15+ year career at HBO, which we'll talk a lot about today, and is doing really interesting things in the global media market, production market, vis-a-vis TV and film with Legendary Global. So Anne, I want to say hello and welcome to GEMA Talks.
Thank you. Hi, Rich.
It's good to see you. So just for our audience to know, you are living globally right now, living internationally.
Yes.
I'm tell our members where you are.
I'm based in Prague, the Czech Republic.
Wow. We'll get into that in a minute to understand a little more about that. But thanks for doing this. I want to start just by talking a little bit more about Legendary Global, which is a really interesting company. Do you mind just talking a little bit about the short history of the company and your role and what you're doing there?
Sure. Yeah. So Legendary Global is a joint venture between Legendary Global, Chris Albrecht, and myself. Legendary Entertainment, Chris Albrecht, and myself. Chris, after leaving Starz, was looking for something to do and really saw entertainment moving into sort of a more global format with a focus on international television. After leaving HBO, I actually worked primarily internationally and have a dual nationality with France and the United States. So I've worked all over Europe. I think I've produced one thing in the United States in the last 15 years. So my focus had always been sort of more international, and that sort of stemmed from all the work I did at HBO, from the Earth to the Moon, which was seemingly American, but was the global space race and sold widely across the globe, to Band of Brothers, which was a big co-production, and then to Rome. So I leaned in that direction and then just continued on that path, so that when Chris entered into his negotiations with Legendary to create this JV, he reached out to me and asked me if I would come into it with him, which I was really happy to do because we had such a great working relationship at HBO.
And what more specifically are you tasked with and charged with?
Well, what we're really trying to do in a lot of ways is sort of repeat the same kind of format that we used at HBO, which is basically to identify talent and create an environment where they could do their best work. So, the good news about Legendary Global is that we have a pretty healthy balance sheet. We have learned in the past, when I was at HBO, it was a very lean operation. There were, just a couple of executives reporting into, Chris Albrecht and Bridget Potter at the very beginning. And we were both very hands-on and very hands-off at the same time. So hands-on, and we really tried to identify talent, hands-off, and that we like to try to trust, to really trust them, and then sort of steer them, nurture them in ways that sort of would make whatever their vision was the best version of what it could be. So what we're doing now is we're really looking at talent sort of across the globe in multiple territories that we've identified that we feel strongly about, and partnering with them.
And when you say talent, you mean potentially like writing talent, creative talent, behind the screen talent, or also on-screen talent? You mean mostly creative folks?
Primarily behind, behind the camera talent. Although, look, if there was on-camera talent that had an idea that wanted to execute it, there is one project that we're doing actually between Spain and London through a JV we have in Madrid, where it's a young actress who's written something. She's written 8 episodes of it. It's really wonderful. She's going to star in it, but she needs a showrunner. She needs help. So we're going to try to create that environment for her so that she can go from being a 23-year-old actress who's, doing very well on her own, to a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, showrunner, writer, and star of her own show.
That's great. And are you focused on certain territories, or are you literally you'll look all over the world?
We'll look all over the world depending on who our partners are. So for instance, we have a couple of projects with talent based in India. And because the sort of production model in India and the production budgets are so low, we are actually committing on 2 projects to fully finance the productions. because it's an investment of, say, whatever, a couple $1,000,000, $2-3 million to do multiple episodes. And we feel confident enough in the scripts to say, you know what, we'll order the show ourselves and then sell it on the open market. So we're doing things as entrepreneurial as that. And then also partnering with people who are more established. We have a JV, as I said, in Spain with a guy named Ancho Rodriguez, who owns a talent agency called Alter Ego Talent House. Alter Ego represents some of the best and brightest, young talent writers, directors, producers. So we have access to tremendous material. And then we actually created a production entity with him. He created something called a Spotlight, which is going to be like a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Is it it's a joint venture, you said?
It's a joint venture between, a Spotlight is a joint venture between Alter Ego or Ancho and Legendary Global. So we're really going to incubate his talent and hopefully create like an anonymous content based in Spain.
Oh, that's great. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I really want to go back to the beginning of your career in a minute. You've had this amazing career and you've had such a global career. When did you start? Well, actually, let's start. I want to go back to Georgetown, actually. So, and then I'm going to later come back to your current role. And I want to ask you about some trends in the industry and such. But let's talk about, so you're at Georgetown, and you had a family that was into business, right? Your dad was Tony Thomopoulos, by the way, everyone, another great, proud Hoya, who ran ABC, among many other things. And so you grew up sort of in the business in that way a little bit. But when you went to Georgetown, you were in the college, you're an English major. What did you think you wanted to do with your career when you were at Georgetown?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I sort of was raised as much as I was, very well educated, obviously, there was no pressure on me to even find a career. And I think that, coming from a very traditional sort of immigrant family, and at that time, I mean, my father, who I would ask to counsel me, had no idea how to counsel a woman who was interested in working. Like, it just wasn't part of his social or cultural vocabulary. So every time I would ask, he would say, like, don't worry, I'll take care of you. So, there was I always had 3 jobs. I ran the art gallery at Georgetown, and I worked at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and I worked for the American Film Institute, but it never felt real. Yeah. And there was never any focus from my family, or there was no support. There was no mentorship. So it was very different as a young woman then versus now, because I didn't even think about, sort of career.
Right. Interesting.
I mean, I tried to, but there wasn't, I don't know how to describe what the world was like. I feel like, it was like horse and buggy, but,
so given that sort of lack of clarity, what did you do when you graduated?
Well, actually, when I graduated, I was really interested in fashion. So I moved to New York, and I ended up getting a job working with a really wonderful fashion photographer, a hugely talented woman named Brigitte Lacombe. But I was living in a family apartment basically on Fifth Avenue, like with signature accounts at different places, and, making no money. And it was just, it wasn't serious. And then, when my father decided to get remarried, he was like, okay, now I have new priorities, like, you're on your own. So I was very lucky, because I had a relationship with Bill Haber, obviously through my father, and that's where sort of family connections and having grown up in the business really did help me, is that he sort of just threw me a bone and said, here, you can have a job working at Whit Thomas Harris out in Los Angeles, like, just get yourself out to LA. So I started working as an assistant to an associate producer on a multi-camera tape comedy, and, was just in the office all the time, bringing home $232.32. I will never forget that. I mean, that amount every week, it was like, and every penny was accounted for. Yeah. And then, I just worked my butt off. And, I think where Georgetown really came in to play was, I was able to read and to analyze and to understand story and story structure. So I very quickly moved off of sort of the post-production onto Tony Thomas and Paul Witt and Susan Harris's sort of radar as someone who could identify good writers and could staff a show.
And that
So,
part, you really enjoyed that part.
yeah, I mean, it was way more up my alley than,
Actual production part of it.
yeah, sound mixing, which I'm not bad at, and I can do that, but it just wasn't not my thing.
Yeah. Okay, so you're with Thomas Harris and moving up the ladder there. What happens next?
What happened next was I thought I wanted to go back to design school. So I ended up leaving and going back to school for like a semester, and then realized, like, having earned money and been independent, it was just,
right.
I couldn't commit.
Yeah.
So I actually was friendly with a guy named Donald DeLine, who is a big producer now, but at the time was recently hired to run Michael J. Fox's company. And that was at the time of, Back to the Future 2. So right. Michael was a big deal, family ties.
Yeah.
So Donald hired me to be his director of development. But there was a big strike, so I couldn't start work for a while. And then my first day of work, Donald was nowhere to be seen. So I was a little bit concerned. And on day 2, he called me and said, "Come to my office, I have something to tell you." And I guess during the strike, he had been courted by Touchstone. So he informed me that I didn't have to take the job if I didn't want to, but that he was leaving and he didn't know who was going to replace him. So I did what any good Jesuit raised girl would do. I asked for Michael's agents' names and to have a meeting with them. So I got into my little car and I drove across town and I sat on Peter Benedek and Marty Bauer's couch and told them that they should give me the job running Michael's company, even though I'd only been there a day. And that I would do it for free for 6 months, and it would take them 6 months to find someone they liked anyway. So they should just give me the job. And I think they were so shocked that they said yes. So that's what happened.
I love it. It's a great story.
Yeah.
And then was that mostly features then?
No, it was features. Yeah, it was mostly features, and it was still comedy. So, yeah, we worked on several projects and we ended up getting green lights on 3 of them, but we ended up never making them. And what I didn't realize at the time was, of course, Michael had just recently been diagnosed. So he was a little bit unfocused, completely understandably. Yeah. And I think Marty and Peter were very concerned with having him work with sort of the best and the brightest, both, producers, new directors, people that they thought were going to really make a mark. Because they didn't know what was going to happen with his health. So I got very frustrated. And of course, understandably, Michael couldn't divulge what was going on. And so I started looking for another job. And it was really sad for me because, I really adored Michael, and it was really, we were, basically the same age, and it was so much fun. I mean, it was so much fun. We had like bicycles, we'd drive around the lot together, we'd figure out ideas. It was just great fun. Yeah. So it was very sad to leave.
25 years old or something.
Yeah, we were babies. Yeah. But it was really fun. So I ended up at the time, I think Gavin Pallone set me up with Chris Albrecht, because I basically decided I really loved working with feature talent, but I loved the pace of television. The feature pace was too slow, having had green lights on some projects and not being able to make them. It just didn't make sense to me. Whereas, when you get an order in television, you go. Yeah. So that's what I asked. I was talking to Gavin and I said, I want feature talent, television pace. And he said, you need to meet Chris Albrecht. So.
And Chris was running HBO at the time? Or
Chris was the
running content?
Senior vice president of original programming, something like that. So he was looking for someone to start a drama series division. And I had 0 experience in drama. But I think, again, having been so educated in sort of literature, story, classics, sort of the great tropes of storytelling and the ability to identify good writing really helped me, because he gave me 2 projects that they had greenlit, and I read them, and then he asked me to have dinner so that we could discuss them, and he asked me what I thought, and I told him I thought they were both horrible. And he asked me why, and I was able to communicate why I thought they were really bad ideas. And he was a little bit frustrated, but I think he was sort of surprised that I was so, I don't want to say combative, but just willing to tell the truth, because I think usually in interviews like that, people just, say what they think the other person wants to hear. So he pulled the plug on both those projects, much to the dismay of the producers, one of whom was Don Ohlmeyer, who I don't know if you had any experience with Don, but he was really not happy that a 26-year-old girl who he didn't respect pulled the plug on his project.
Yep. He was old school for sure.
Oh yeah. And so yeah, he pulled the plug on, both of them, and then hired me, and our first drama series was Oz.
Oh, wow. Right. And I mean, you had an incredible run as an executive there, incredible run of programming. I mean, you had Oz, you had From Earth to the Moon, right? I think Band of Brothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What, talk a little bit about those projects. What was sort of like what was, before you moved on to the producing side, what was sort of the key highlights in that job, or what's from a content perspective, what do you think of first?
I think what was so nice and what was so privileged about that situation was we were a really, really small team. I was the only person in drama. So it was really about what I wanted to do. I would discuss things with Chris, and we'd have a staff meeting where people would weigh in. But in terms of, focus and being able to identify writers and projects that you wanted to work on, it was really lean, which made things really nice. And it was sort of, so there were no real politics.
Yeah.
So that sort of streamlined the process. And, the other thing that was so incredible about that period was there was no competition. I mean, there was no Netflix, there were no other premium television producers with the exception of Showtime, but Showtime's means were, they just didn't seem to have, sort of the money or the, the subscriber base that HBO did. So it was just different.
Yeah. You guys kind of ruled the land.
Yeah. I mean, and it's very easy to be courageous when there's no roadmap. No one had done it before. You're not compared to anybody else. You just compare yourself to you, and you're pushing boundaries that haven't been explored yet. Yeah. So, with Oz, what was so interesting about it was, we were looking for a drama series and a precinct that hadn't been explored. So it was obvious to me that we couldn't do something that was medical. We couldn't do something that was legal. We couldn't do something in the world of policing. And when Tom came in with this idea about a prison that was one set, something that everyone can relate to, sort of a fixed cast of characters with guest stars, if you will, it made perfect sense. But what was fascinating to me was that Tom had worked primarily, obviously, in broadcast television. He'd just come off of St. Elsewhere, which was a beautifully written show, but also didn't push boundaries in the same way that we're pushing. So it really took a long time to get the script to the place that it ultimately got. And once Tom rid himself of the shackles of, traditional television, there was obviously no stopping him. Like, I don't know, I think he killed everyone in the cast twice. So,
well, that was the other, obviously, major advantage of HBO at the time, which was it was really the only TV outlet that could truly push the boundaries.
Yeah.
And so you had this kind of rich playground to play in, to really break completely new formats and completely new writing and storytelling and the like. I mean, it's in dialogue and language, and it's been pretty exciting. Yeah.
I mean, profanity was such a big deal.
Yeah, back then it was. So one thing that's interesting about your career is you then, tell me if I'm wrong, but you at some point you then shifted more to like the producing side under the HBO banner. So talk a little bit about that shift, and obviously one of your most well-known shows that you EP'd was Rome, and maybe just if you can talk a little bit about how you made that shift and what was it like going to that side of the.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because when I started doing drama series, we did, Oz, which was obviously a manageable series. And then after Oz, Chris asked me to start a miniseries division. So when I started the miniseries area, the first show was From the Earth to the Moon, which was a very big budget at the time. It was $65 million.
Wow.
And from there, we did Band of Brothers. And it was interesting because, we worked with Tom Hanks on both of those projects. And I think that what was the way we got there was, Apollo 11 came out, and then we thought, oh, that's really interesting. Like it would be fascinating to explore the entire space race, not just one element of the space race. And then same thing with Band of Brothers was, you had Saving Private Ryan, but we had these Stephen Ambrose books that actually I found because Mark Johnson, the producer, had given an interview in the LA Times about a book that he had just bought called Citizen Soldiers. So I called him, and he was very amenable and interested in, talking to us. And then I got a call from Tom Hanks's company saying, like, you're buying the wrong book. The real book to buy is Band of Brothers. And I just said, you guys, I know, you're all best friends, so you're playing me.
Right.
I know we have to buy both books, but we want to do this, so let's do it. And that again was a very high budget project. So I was spending the same kind of money on one project that the entire movie division was spending in a year, or even more. So as these things started to develop, I realized that I was really much more of a producer than I was an executive, because as an executive, you're juggling multiple projects, dealing with people, handing things off. And when you're dealing with a project that's, first $65 million, then Band of Brothers was 120 million. And then Rome was the first continuing series that in its first season topped $100 million. It wasn't supposed to, but it did. I basically said to Chris Albrecht, I'm fine running this department, but I'm really not an executive. I'm really an executive producer. So he allowed me to become an executive producer on Rome, which was great. And then from there, I just thought I was just ready to sort of do more, because the agenda changed at HBO as well. I mean, it felt like things were getting bigger, more commercial, there were more layers. And there was this thought process that we could do one big miniseries and one small miniseries a year, and it was going to be great. And, I just remember saying to him, like, I just don't think that's possible. Like, maybe I'm making it look too easy, but just because you will it, it doesn't mean it happens. And, to mount $120 million series is you have to find a great piece of underlying material. You have to develop it with great writers. You have to have, you have to attract all this talent. And that's really, it's time consuming. You can't just order up a big one and a small one. So I just thought if I had stayed as an executive, it was potentially not going to be too fruitful. And I was really curious to just stretch my wings a little, which I did.
Talk about because I assume that it's quite a difference, but talk about the difference in being an executive at either at a programming outlet or a production entity, and being an actual producer of just help the audience, maybe folks who aren't as familiar with the differences and what skill sets you have to draw on that are different between.
Well, first, it is so scary to go from like sitting in your office and having
your cushy office
with your assistant, with your pension, with your benefits, with your paycheck that just gets auto deposited every 2 weeks,
right,
to like, okay, make it happen.
Yeah.
You got to really be ready for that.
With serious money on the line too.
Yeah, it's scary. But I think the difference is that there's just more of an intimacy with the material when you're actually producing, and more of a, you just get your hands dirtier. You live with the project. You're usually traveling a little bit more, but until you're producing, you're able to be home more, which was also another motivator for me. As I had, I think my daughter was 12 or 10 when I started producing, and it just felt like the right time to spend more time at home with her. And I was very lucky because I was able to transition into a first look deal at HBO. And then when Chris left and went to Stars, I had a deal with him as well. So that definitely made the financial component a bit easier.
Mm.
But yeah, I think the producing thing is it requires a lot of focus. And it's just it's more intimate, and you get more invested, and the stakes are higher because they're just higher. If you're an executive, you get to cherry pick.
And there's a sense when you're an executive, if you're working on 10 projects, not everyone's going to go to the finish line. Some may work, some not. But when you're working on one,
and you may like one more than the other. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be in production. It's fine. If you make something and it wasn't your favorite project, but it does well, great. Whereas when it's like, when you're producing, it's an exaggeration to say your projects are like your children, but you do definitely get invested. And when you spend a lot of time on something, you want to see it realized.
And when you move to the producer side, I assume at that point, are you now also having to hear notes from the executives? And so now you're kind of on the other side of that conversation. And
yeah.
I assume in some ways
that's
an advantage because you know how they think, but in some ways it's probably, irritating too.
Well, I mean, for me, I actually didn't know how they think because, HBO was such a rarefied environment. So to go in and pitch to people, or if you're going in to pitch to another production company because you need help and you think like, why am I pitching to this person? Like what do they think they know that I don't know? But when you end up with a great executive who's got really good notes, I mean, it's actually fantastic sometimes to get really smart notes and it makes the project better. I think that's one of the things about television that can be so rewarding is that it's a really collaborative medium. And I think a good writer in that medium is actually very open to hearing notes and trying to make them work, and then being able to articulate why they will accept or want to reject a note. So it's the process is interesting, and I think it's great for your communication skills, that's for sure.
One thing that people may not appreciate who are watching today too is when you work in the global production environment, there's so many areas of expertise you need to have, and just talk a little bit about some of they may be arcane, but really important about tax credits and producing in other countries and timetables, and just talk a little bit about how that is often a challenge, but also in some ways, can be beneficial because of tax credits and things. So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the most important thing is to really know what you don't know and to not be afraid to say, I don't know. Because there's a cultural component to everything that, there are different ways of doing business. There are different ways of producing. Producers are very different things. So for instance, in France, traditionally producers have been the keeper of the purse strings. They hold the money. And because French programming traditionally hasn't sold globally, producers are often really consumed with, just keeping their margin. And not so much about sort of the creative validity. And so they aren't often, willing to sacrifice some money for what's going to be a better project. And it's understandable, but I think you have to be very careful about who you work with, and then choosing partners who know, and who are actually indigenous to that culture. And that's one of the things that I think we're being very careful about with Legendary Global, is to enter every territory in a very authentic way and a very respectful way. I just had a conversation with an executive in Germany about a project that we're going to be working on. And she said, it's so interesting that you're an American company that wants to get involved in this. And, we're a little bit reticent because, the Americans do things like X, Y, Z. And I just said to her, we're very lean. It's basically Chris and me, and we're making our producers our partners. So the producers on this particular project have a very intimate knowledge of the material that they're developing. They're based in Berlin. They're of the ethnicity of the characters. They have a very personal story to tell. If this story were being told by the showrunner of Breaking Bad, regardless of that person's credits, they wouldn't be the right person. And we wouldn't be interested in the show, because I can't be an expert in what it's like to be an urban woman living in Berlin in 2020. So I think that's the thing that you need to be very careful of, is to recognize, like, there are areas of expertise that you develop over time, but they don't necessarily translate directly to the territory that you're working in. So it's really important to work with people that you can communicate your knowledge to, but but to have your ears open to why something does or doesn't work. And to this executive's credit, she said to me, you know, we think that's great because we've looked at the material that you guys have collectively made, and we think, you know, the look and the level of production is fantastic. And the issue that we have in Germany is sometimes we have great stories, but they aren't up to the creative level visually because people do things in a certain way. So it's interesting to find people that you can, you know, communicate your strengths and weaknesses to, and know when to back off and when to step forward.
Yeah, no, I imagine those are really important types of skills when you're working across the world. And like you said, so many different nuances in each territory, in each part of the world,
Yeah.
and how people approach
But
production.
But again, in a lot of ways, I think I can credit Georgetown with at least some of my cultural sensitivity because,
Yeah.
you know, it is such an international institution.
Yeah.
And, you know, the languages that you hear spoken and the cultures that you're exposed to and the way people work and speak and party and eat and,
Yeah.
you know, all of
I've
that
heard,
stuff, you become acculturated very early.
yeah, I've heard that from others who I've interviewed who said something similar. Um, so one thing I want to ask you about, and you're a perfect person to ask this about, is just the trends and the changes over these years in the business and production in global markets. Talk a little bit about what's it like today versus 25 years ago or 20 years ago. It's changed. The business has changed so much. What are some of the key differences that you see in the business right now as you work in it day to day?
Well, I think obviously the arrival of the streamers on an international level has changed everything. I mean, when I first started working and doing shows that were internationally focused, you know, they were from a big US broadcaster and they were always brought into a foreign territory. Nothing ever traveled back.
Right.
And so I think, you know, for the first few years where, you know, international or quote unquote international was becoming more popular and people were looking for international programming, it really was sort of American programming that shot abroad. So you'd hear people say like, yeah, I have an international show. And it would be, you know, an American woman goes looking for her kid who was kidnapped in wherever. Well, that's not really an international show. So I think that that's a huge difference. And it's very interesting now to see sometimes, you know, American writers will call me and be like, hey, has anyone thought of doing a show about Napoleon? And I'm like, yes. And if we were going to do a show about Napoleon, which I think it's been done, I'm really sorry, but you're not the writer for it because you're like American living in Beverly Hills. Like it's just not going to happen.
Right.
And I think that the other thing that's happened is because the streamers need to create 20% of their programming, I think it's 20% in the territory with local producers. Those producers have now been exposed globally. So when you look at shows like Casa del Papel or, you know, Elite or, you know, Deutschland 83 or Babylon Berlin, all of those shows, Baby, and, you know, they're all shows that now are exposed on a larger scale and a larger platform, which is interesting.
Yeah. Has the job changed much in all those years, or is it still kind of the same?
I think it's just, for me, it's evolved in that, you know, I'm doing some local language programming. So it's, you know, it's different. The budgets in the US are very different than the budgets in Europe or in India or in Mexico. So I think you just need to be
Beating a lot higher.
Yeah, I think you just need to be nimble. You know, you really need to be nimble, and then again, partner with people who understand how business is done and do your research to be sure that you're not underestimating things or overestimating things, and that you're delivering, you know, what's expected to the level that you want to deliver to.
Yeah. Are there certain markets or territories right now that you find particularly interesting, or that you think are doing really interesting things in the content space?
Well, I'm really intrigued by Spain. There seems to be such a plethora of talent, but it's interesting having my hands in it a little. It feels like there's a lack of, a little bit of a lack of discipline. I think that they're, you know, culturally, the Spanish are very much like sort of the Italians or the Greeks.
You
to
kind
cite
of,
our own people.
yeah,
Where
kind
you
of
can
do it
get
as you
super,
go.
but you get super excited about it, and I think passion counts for a lot. But I also think there's a rigor to the way Americans work that is that really serves production well. And it's funny because I think the Germans in some ways are very much like the Americans, in that like they don't mind that discipline.
Right.
Whereas, I was talking to this German producer the other day who said to me, like, yes, we're aware that we don't have the ability that the Americans do. We have really important stories and great stories, and we love our stories and our culture and our language, but we just don't quite know how to pull it over the line. So we would like to bring Americans over to help us learn how to tell our stories, as opposed to the Spanish who'd be like,
You got
oh
it.
my God, I have this great story. I have this great story. It's fantastic. Blah, 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 blah. They just get super excited, which is
Right.
great and wonderful. But that's I want to say it's one of the challenges of working with different cultures, is just,
Yeah. Different methods and different philosophies of how to approach business
yeah.
creation. Yeah. In our remaining time, I'd love to talk a little bit about career advice. Again, you've probably have some really great advice to dispense on folks who are listening who either want to break into the business or are kind of early on in the business and want to move up and advance. From your perspective more on the creative side of the business, what are some pieces of advice you would have for these folks?
I think, reading the classics is great to do. Really just trying to understand story, understand what intrigues you about story, and being, I think you have to love story in order to really do this job. And then I think if you're a writer, write. If you're a director, even if you can't physically direct, with a big camera, like take your iPhone out and just practice, 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 practice. I think that it's a particularly challenging time now, obviously, given COVID, because so much of what we do, and particularly on the global level, is relational. I think that that's the other thing, is that Europeans, Latin Americans, even the Indians, everything's very relational. I think that's the one thing about Americans that's very different, is that they're much more transactional.
Yeah.
But I do think that even given that, as well as I, like, we've had a relationship for years. So when you call me and say, will you do this? I'm like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But if I didn't know you, if we hadn't met so many years ago, like, would I be that open to doing it? I don't know.
Right.
So I think that's the thing that's probably really challenging for young people right now, is that there's an inability to actually network. I was talking to an agent yesterday who was saying to me that she felt so badly for her assistant, because, when you're 22, 23, 24, and you get this job that you get paid no money to do, basically, and you're working your butt off, what makes it worthwhile is like hanging out with your mailroom buddies, and that the cream rises to the top, and then you meet people, and then agents take you under their wing, or, so I think that's a huge challenge for sort of young talent right now. But I also think that there are outlets for people to express themselves creatively and to get noticed. Whether it's, I don't know, Instagram, TikTok, Reels. Like,
Yeah.
I just think that, this period is really challenging for people, but I also think that sometimes when you're squeezed, you end up being more creative. So I think it's really about preparation and perseverance and, just doing the work.
Yeah.
But it's a tough time right now.
One question we get asked a lot is, hey, I'm, young person, just getting started, but I have this, I'm sure you're going to laugh when I say it, but I have this script that I've written, and they ask, how do I get people to see my script or notice my script? And obviously, as we all know well, a lot of companies don't take, unsolicited submissions and the likes. Any advice for a young person who, legitimately maybe has a really interesting project with an interesting take, but they're like, what do I do now? How do I get people?
That's a really interesting question, especially now that, like, it's not even like go find an assistant in an agency who can read your script, who can kick it up it's just, That's tricky. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is, I think, get some friends together and make a podcast.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Figure out how to
because you can do it now, and you can do it incredibly cheaply, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the great thing about technology. And, I'm sure the people watching this have more access and more knowledge about how technology could work for them than I do.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I feel like, the words are what's important, and the voice of a script is what's important. So it's not necessarily if you have like a ton of money to, splash something across the screen. If the story's great, words should be enough. So it's interesting because it's almost like retro in that it's like sort of like an old radio drama.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably doable. And I think owning your IP in that way and having something out in the market actually becomes more valuable, especially if you can just get some traction on it. And I think that, smart young people always seem to be managing to do that. So
that's a great piece of advice. I love that. So my final question is also in the advice world, but it's related to you personally. So what would you tell your younger Anne Thomopoulos self if you could give that person advice now, going back? What would the advice be, or anything you would suggest that Anne Thomopoulos does to build her career?
I would say, don't be afraid to take risks. And this is a business where you can feel like the world is coming to an end. And in one phone call, you can feel like things change on a dime. So no matter how bad it gets, just know that the next call or the next email or the next text can change your life.
That's really great. That's powerful. I love that. And
but don't you feel like it's so true? Like you can have the worst day and then you get one phone call and you're like, yes, I'm crushing it.
Yeah.
Like it's
wild. Particularly in the creative side, where you can get a call on Monday where 5 people reject your project, and then Tuesday someone calls and says they want to finance this amazing project you have.
Right.
It's just been reignited.
I mean, I just think it's like with anything in life. I think everyone's going to get knocked down. It's the difference is who gets up. So.
Well, what a perfect way to end our chat. That was good inspirational end. So, Anne, thank you. This has been great.
Thank you. It's been so nice talking to you.
Really loved it. And stay safe in Europe, and good luck with all your projects with Legendary Global. It sounds like you've got a lot on your plate. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Okay. Bye.
Bye.